Hello everybody, thanks for watching. This is Nathaniel Kramer, also known as Preaching Musician. And for this video, I'm going to be beginning a series on the gospel. This video and the next video will be about why we need the gospel. The last video will be about what the gospel is itself, and I'll be talking about that. But I think before we get into what the gospel is and what it does for us, we need to understand why we need it. We need to understand what the problem that we're facing and our condition as humans. And so I'm going to get into who we are and why we need the gospel because of who we are. And the next video will be about who God is and why we need the gospel because of Him. So I'm going to be looking at Romans chapter 3, and we're going to kind of go through this chapter. I'll go to other passages, but we'll stay in Romans chapter 3 for the most part. I'm going to start in verse 9. It says, "What then? Are we better than they? No, in no wise, for we have before proved, both Jews and Gentiles, that they are all under sin." And before we think about, who's going to go to heaven, who's not going to go to heaven, who is God going to accept, who's God not going to accept, right away Paul says, look, this is not an issue of race. This is not an issue of, what family do you belong to, what religion you belong to, who you associate yourself with. It's not even a matter of whether or not you think you're more moral than someone else. The bottom line is that we're all under sin. We're all in the same boat together in this thing. And for you to think you can look at somebody else and say, I'm going to make it to heaven because I'm better than you. I'm going to make it to heaven because I'm this race, or whatever category you put yourself in, God doesn't look at that. He says, look, we're all under sin. It doesn't matter who you are. It even goes further in verse 10. It says, "As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one." This is actually a quote from the Psalms. And right away, God says, look, you're not righteous. You may think you're righteous, you may try to be righteous, but you're not. And in fact, in one of the prophetic books, the Bible says that our righteousness are as filthy rags. It's a reference to the rags they would put on a pole outside the city for lepers to come and wipe their pus off their arms. And if you ever heard about leprosy, it's one of the most repulsive diseases you could get. They would make everyone stay outside the gate until they died. That's how repulsive that disease was. That's how contagious it was. And for us to come to God with our righteousness, it's like a leper trying to put on these filthy rags and say, God, look at me. See, look, I got these rags on. See, aren't you so proud of me? Aren't you going to accept me now? God says, look, it doesn't work that way. There's just no way. The Bible says, look, there's none righteous, no, not one. That means not me, it means not you, it means not nobody, okay? And it goes further than that. It says, there is none that understandeth, there is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way, they are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. And that's a very bold statement to make, and I'm not making that statement, God's making that statement. And when the Bible says there is none that doeth good, that means when you give donations, that means if you feed the poor, that means if you go to church, that means if you get baptized, that means no matter what you do, the Bible says here, there is none that doeth good, no, not one. Now, how is that possible? Well, I'm going to look down at verse 23, and I think it'll give us a little insight into what that means and how that can even be possible. It says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." When we think about the glory of God, it's the very reason why we were created. And I believe it's the book of Isaiah. The Bible says that we were created for God's glory. And in Revelation, it says we were created for God's pleasure. And those are the two reasons the Bible gives for our very purpose of existence. And anytime we do something that goes against that, anytime we do something that is not for God's glory, it's a sin. So many people, they'll give donations, they'll try to do things that will help society, but you got to ask, why are they doing those things? Even when I ask myself, why am I doing these things? If it's to exalt myself, if it's to make myself look good, if it's so I can feel better about myself, stroke my ego, that's not for God's glory. That doesn't fulfill the purpose we were existed for. And think about that. God, He's the Creator. He deserves all the glory. And yet, we defy the very purpose of our existence when we do not glorify God. I mean, we're talking about the God who tells the rocks and the hills where to go. He tells the mountains to be lifted up. They're lifted up. He tells the stars to go in their place. They go where He tells them to go. All creation obeys God. And when God tells us to do just simple things, He tells us don't lie. He tells us don't fornicate. He tells us very simple things. Don't do this. And we tell Him no. The very things that would even help us in our well-being, we disobey Him. When all of creation doesn't dare disobey God, we rebel. Now, if you know anything about the Bible and about Christianity, you know the first to rebel against God was Satan. And he rebelled in heaven. And Jesus Himself said the reason why God created hell was for the devil and his angels. And hell is a horrible place, and I wouldn't wish my worst enemy to go there. But the Bible gives very vivid description of hell, and it talks about who's going to go to hell. And I'm going to read a passage from Revelation chapter 21. And I want you to think about these groups that it talks about and ask yourself if you're in one of these groups. It says, "But the fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars," that means anybody who's ever told a lie, "shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." And I've been in many debates with people over whether or not the Bible says there is a hell. And you can twist the different words. You can pull the Greek word out and say, oh, it doesn't really mean hell. It means the grave. It means different things. And there's a lot of arguments for that. But this verse is very clear. It doesn't even actually use the word hell. It just says lake of fire. It actually says lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So right there we have the tie-in. When the Bible says the wages of sin is death, what we earn when we sin, that's death. And the Bible says that when it talks about death, it's not just talking about when you die and when your body goes in the grave. It goes beyond that. It goes to the second death, which is the lake of fire. Now I got to ask you, if you've ever lied, if you've ever done one of these things that it mentions here, and the Bible says all men are liars. We looked in Romans chapter 3 where it says there is none that doeth good. It means we all qualify for hell. And I know that's not a statement that many people today will use. And most modern evangelists, they won't tell you anything negative. But I'm not here to just preach positive things. I'm not here just to stroke your feelings. I'm here to tell you the truth. I think that's what we need, especially in a day and age where the truth has become hated. I think we need the truth. And this is the truth right here. So I got to ask you, have you thought about this? Do you know where you're going when you die? Because if you don't have the gospel, and we'll get into this in 2 weeks after we talk about God and who He is. But if you don't have the gospel, this is your destiny. And so I want you to research this, and there's a lot more I could say here, but I'm going to cut this short. But I want you to really look at this. And if you don't know Jesus, if you don't know Christ, think about this. Think about your condition. Think about the fact that you have done the very same thing that caused God to create hell in the first place for Satan. You've rebelled against God. And even right now, many of you are sitting there and you're saying, I hate God. I don't want anything to do with Him. Well, that's not a good thing. So please, I beg you, please look into it and please watch the next video. Thank you so much for watching. I know this wasn't the most positive video, but we'll get more positive later, I promise. Thanks for watching.